it's kind of hard to think of if you go back 100 years, pro football really wasn't a thing. So what was the early instances of football in the United States, and how did the pro football game even get started to ramp up in 100 years to what it is today?
Like all sports, American sports, almost all of them, it came from overseas. It came from England. As it started out as a form of rugby, it traces back to the 1860s and 70s, a field game in which there was a ball and people hit each other, and that's what it grew out of. And then it was on college campuses and high schools, 1890s, 1900, and you really start to see it become popular strictly in high schools and in colleges was really the first place where you saw college football. I mean, they settled on, 4 downs to get 10 yards, the value of a touchdown. I mean, you really had to come through that stuff. And then by 1910, and there was a lot of violence in the beginning. They had problems with players dying on the field, and they sort of had to figure out how to make it a game, and not a death trap. And so they got through that. And then by 1910 or 15, you had college football becoming very popular in the United States. High school football also in some places, and pro game was nothing. It was, as a matter of fact, it was looked down upon. The whole point of football in American culture in that time frame, it was viewed as a vehicle for turning boys into men, right? In absence of real war, this was a game of war. And that's how it was seen. And that's why it became so popular in high school, in high schools in Texas and Pennsylvania and Ohio. It was take your boys, put them on the gridiron and turn them into men. And so it was thought that to actually pay someone to do that was considered irresponsible. Why would you ever pay someone to play football when what we're doing is creating men? All right. And that's an absence of real war. And so what happened was these semi-pro leagues, but the game itself was becoming popular. And so in these little Midwestern industrial towns, they started having these teams, semi-pro teams. There weren't very many fans, but it grew out of that. A team in Akron would go play a team in Dayton or whatever. And it just started to grow that cities had teams. And finally, the NFL organized. There were enough around that they organized at a league meeting in 1920 and started playing. And it was very unorganized. The schedule was unorganized. Players jumped from team to team. Contracts were ignored. Teams folded. And this is really a lot of it throughout the first 10 years of the NFL. It was fly-by-night organization. There was a chance it would fail. And, the games weren't that interesting. And so it was barely making it. Meanwhile, college football was soaring. So there was many reasons to think that pro football would just never even make it.
I was kind of reading what the average play was in the 1920s. It doesn't sound entertaining at all. It sounds absolutely brutal. It's just a mass of people scrumming, hitting elbows. I think I was reading a book about Vince Lombardi and how they were like teaching people this is the proper way to flip an elbow without getting caught and penalized for it. It was just really a brutal sport, and I can't imagine it was great to watch. But it started to growing at a little bit of acceleration in kind of this Rust Belt, what we would call the Rust Belt today. Why was that kind of like the petri dish for professional football?
Well, that's a good question. That as to why it happened there, as opposed to, I mean, it pretty quickly grew over to the East Coast and to cities. Baseball, which was by far the most popular sport in America, was really an agrarian-based sport, right? It was rural. And so football was more. I mean, they weren't big cities, but they were little cities, could have teams. And so as for why it happened in places like Akron, Ohio, and different places, it's hard to say why. I mean, they had population there, and they had the people with money, and they had the sports. It grew out of baseball. A lot of the first owners of teams and sort of league administrators came from baseball. You almost had to. They'd run leagues or they'd played when they were younger. And so there was a lot of minor league baseball and Major League Baseball there. And so, it just sort of, I think the mechanization of it a little bit. I mean, these were industrial towns, and a lot of the teams were owned by industry. That's where the Chicago Bears came from. Was they started out as a team, owned by a company, and so that's part of it. That's where the money was, and it just grew out of there. It's really hard to pinpoint exactly why, except the petri dish. All the ingredients were there for to make it more popular.
Describe to us some of these like early characters around it. It wasn't this idea of what we have today where you have an owner who owns the team, and then they have the GM who's selecting the personnel, and the coach who's coaching them up, and then you have designated players. There was literally owner, player, GM, coaches that were doing everything under the sun. So what are the kind of these early characters that were forming these teams?
Well, Curly Lambeau in Green Bay, he started out he sort of started the Green Bay Packers, and no, there was no organization. There was like Curly, he did everything, and he was the coach, and so he did everything and talked players into playing, and they maybe had somebody else to type up the contracts or something, which were ignored. But so a lot of them were just guys like that, men of sport. I mean, Curly had played college football and maybe 1 year, at Notre Dame, and he was just sort of an entrepreneur. All these guys were, I mean, they just were sort of men of sport, and they were definitely gamblers. There was a very strong gambling component. I mean, Tim Mara, who started the New York Giants in 1925 for $500, was a bookie, a professional bookie. His job, and a successful one. He went to the racetrack every day, and back in the day, you didn't bet if you went to the horse races. You didn't bet like with the house as you do today on a computerized tote board. You bet with a guy, bookie, and so they were lined up 10 of them, and you could pick the one you wanted, and it was a personal transaction. And so he was very good at it. And so Tim Mara was a gambler. Art Rooney, who started the Pittsburgh Steelers in 1933, never worked a day in his life. He made his money. Well, some of it I think was illicit stuff, running barrels and stuff like that. But if he really needed to make money, he went to the horse races and bet. And he was one of the great gamblers in the history of America. And so that's where Bert Bell, who started the Philadelphia Eagles and was a son of wealth, real wealth of mainline Pennsylvania, blew all the money. And, he blew a lot of it. He had to borrow from his wife to start the Eagles because he'd blown all the money and been cut off by his dad. And he was a huge gambler. And so they were all sort of just, came from different backgrounds, but they were gamblers far more, almost more than anything else, and willing to try things. We don't have lives like this in America anymore. And, these men, Tim Mara had his hand in like 10 different things. He had, alcohol, coal, precious metals, sold all these things, just did different things. He was a bookie. He promoted boxing matches. And he started a football team, that wound up is now worth $6 billion. But back then, so that's what those guys did. You just don't have lives like that anymore in America. So they were just sort of resourceful men.